In 1960, New York City was preparing to make a decision that would later send shivers down their spines. It wasn't a tax policy, nor a transportation project, but the demolition of Carnegie Hall. The concert hall considered the soul of American music. The legal procedures were complete, the purchase agreement signed, the replacement office tower designed, and the demolition date on the calendar. For the city government and real estate developers, it was a logical deal. An old building occupying prime real estate in Midtown Manhattan could be replaced by a modern, highly profitable structure. But for artists and those who understood the true value of the place, it was nothing short of a death sentence for an irreplaceable masterpiece. Carnegie Hall is more than just a building. For nearly 70 years, it has been a giant musical instrument, where sound behaves unlike any other space in the world. There, the softest violin note can reach the back rows, and a grand orchestral chord retains its clarity and warmth, without any harshness or chaos. Artists who have performed there have all said the same thing. Carnegie Hall elevates the music, as if the room itself were playing along with them. Remarkably, even in the 20th century, with the remarkable advancements in acoustics, people still cannot fully explain why this space is so perfect. And that's why demolishing Carnegie Hall is not just about tearing down an old building, but about erasing a knowledge hidden by time, a rare combination of 19th century craftsmanship, human intuition, and historical luck. Once this building is gone, no amount of money or technology can guarantee the reconstruction of a second Carnegie Hall. New York may erect hundreds of new office towers, but it will forever lose a space that the entire music world considers a benchmark. Amidst this, one man began to act. He wasn't a politician, an investor, or someone holding any administrative power. He was a violinist, Isaac Stern. At 39, Stern was at the peak of his career, so familiar with Carnegie Hall that he considered it his second home. He understood every nuance of sound, every resonance, every subtlety that the room offered. And he understood better than anyone that if Carnegie Hall were destroyed, the music world would lose something irreplaceable, and New York would bear a cultural stain for generations to come. Stern began doing what no blueprint or contract could stop. He called, wrote, and spoke on radio and television. He convinced conductors, artists, music educators, and even ordinary audiences that this wasn't just an academic story. It was a question of what kind of city New York should be, a city driven solely by short-term profits, or a city mature enough to protect the values that define its identity. The struggle to save Carnegie Hall, which began in 1960, was not just about preserving a building, but about defining the line between progress and destruction, between development and the loss of soul. But to understand why an entire city would stand up for a concertist, we must go back nearly 130 years to a poor boy born in Scotland who inadvertently created the stage for this whole story. His name was Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was born in 1835 in the town of Dunfermline, Scotland, in a single-room house that served as both the family's home and workplace. His father, William Carnegie, was a hand weaver, operating a loom in the living room to produce damask for wealthy clients. His mother, Margaret, had to mend shoes and do odd jobs to make ends meet. The Carnegie family was poor, but it was a poverty that maintained order and dignity because his father had a trade, and his hands still created value. Then the Industrial Revolution arrived like a cold wave. Steam-powered looms appeared, faster, cheaper, and more efficient. In just a few years, the entire hand-weaving industry in Scotland collapsed. William Carnegie's loom became an outdated relic. He lost his job, his income, and, more importantly, his sense of belonging. The Carnegie family slid toward poverty, not because of laziness or incompetence, but because the world had changed faster than their ability to adapt. In 1848, when Andrew was just 12 years old, the Carnegie family made a decision that millions of European families were desperately considering at the time: to leave their homeland and go to America. They borrowed money to buy ship tickets, sailed across the Atlantic, and then continued on to Allegheny, Pennsylvania, where Margaret's relatives lived. When they set foot on American soil, they had almost nothing but the hope that this place would give them a second chance. That opportunity came at a very high price. Andrew Carnegie began working in a cotton mill at the age of 13. His job was to change bobbins for the looms, a repetitive task, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. His wage was $1.20 a week. It was a mindless, uncreative job that could crush the spirit of any child. But Andrew Carnegie refused to let his life be confined to the factory. That boy carried within him an obsession to escape poverty, not by luck, but by knowledge. At night, after exhausting hours of work, Andrew taught himself accounting, how to read, how to write, and how the world worked. He observed wealthy people, memorizing their faces, names, and habits. Andrew soon understood that in America, information was power. When the opportunity arose to become a telegraph operator, Carnegie seized it immediately. The new job paid more and, more importantly, placed him at the center of a network of economic power. Every day, he delivered messages to railroad bosses, bankers, and steel mill owners. He heard the names of those shaping America's future. And while working, Andrew quietly learned to read telegraph signals by sound alone, a rare and highly valuable skill at the time. In a short time, Carnegie became one of Pittsburgh's fastest telegraph operators. This led him to Thomas Scott, a senior executive in the Pennsylvania Railroad. Scott not only hired Carnegie as his secretary and personal telegraph operator, but he also became Carnegie's first mentor in the concept of capital. Scott showed him the fundamental difference between working for a salary and owning something that generates money even without working. The moment of enlightenment came when Carnegie bought his first shares. When his first dividend check arrived, he stared at it for a long time, almost disbelieving his eyes. It was money he hadn't earned through hard work in the factory, but through owning a part of the system. From that moment, Andrew Carnegie's thinking changed forever. The poor boy, once marginalized by machines, now understands that to survive and thrive in the modern world, humans must learn to keep pace with the times, not fight against them. This experience of loss due to technology instilled in Carnegie a belief: progress is irreversible, but it is humanity's responsibility to ensure that progress does not completely destroy human values. From those humble beginnings, Andrew Carnegie embarked on a journey to become one of the wealthiest people in history. But the paradox of his story lies in the fact that it was the very memories of poverty, of being replaced and marginalized, that planted in him a question that haunted him throughout his life. Once at the pinnacle of economic power, what obligation does a person have to the society that created them? And that question, decades later, would lead him to a decision not about steel, money, or profit, but about music, culture, and a building named Carnegie Hall. As Andrew Carnegie entered adulthood, he understood a truth few dared to acknowledge. America was not built on ideals, but on steel. Railroads, bridges, factories, skyscrapers, all required a durable, inexpensive material that could be produced on an unprecedented scale. Carnegie foresaw this future much earlier than others, and he decided to stake his entire destiny on heavy industry. He invested in iron smelters, then steel. But what set Carnegie apart wasn't just his vision, but the way he organized production. He didn't buy individual parts of the supply chain. He swallowed the whole chain. From ore mines and coal to railroad transportation, steel mills, and distribution, everything was within his system. This approach allowed him to ruthlessly control costs, eliminate competitors, and transform Carnegie Steel into the largest and most profitable steel company in America by the end of the 19th century. But that wealth didn't come in pure glory. Carnegie's factories operated with extreme intensity. Workers toiled in dangerous conditions, earned low wages, and any attempts to organize unions were suppressed. This culminated in the Homestead Strike of 1892, one of the bloodiest labor conflicts in American history. Although Carnegie wasn't directly involved, his empire became a symbol of the dark side of industrial capitalism. It was in this very contradiction that something strange happened. Andrew Carnegie, criticized for being cold, pragmatic, and ruthless in business, began to develop a profound ethical philosophy about money. He did not deny the inequality created by industrialization, but he believed that history had chosen a select few to accumulate wealth, and their task was not to enjoy it, but to redistribute it responsibly. In 1889, Carnegie published his famous essay, *The Gospel of Wealth*. In it, he made a statement that shook the era. He who dies rich dies in disgrace. According to Carnegie, wealth should not be left to descendants or hoarded indefinitely, but should be used while the owner is alive to create institutions that help people elevate themselves, education, knowledge, culture. That essay made Carnegie famous beyond the industrial sphere, but it also made him a target of criticism. People asked, how could a man who built an empire by exploiting labor preach about social responsibility? Carnegie did not shy away from that contradiction. On the contrary, he seemed obsessed with it. And that is why he began giving away his money before he died, even while he was still making it. Libraries became his greatest achievement. Thousands of libraries were built across America and English-speaking countries with Carnegie's money. But besides education, there was another passion, less frequently mentioned but profoundly significant: music. Carnegie wasn't a musician, nor did he play any musical instrument skillfully, but he believed that music was one of the rare ways to reach all social classes, transcending writing, language, and status. He went to concerts whenever he could, traveling to Europe solely to hear the greatest artists perform. And each time he returned to New York, he realized something shameful: America's wealthiest and most powerful city lacked a proper concert hall for symphony and classical music. Orchestras had to perform in theaters, churches, and makeshift halls, spaces not designed to accommodate refined acoustics. For Carnegie, it wasn't just a shortcoming in architecture, but a shortcoming in cultural ambition. A nation rising to become an economic powerhouse couldn't remain perpetually behind Europe in the arts. America needed a space to tell the world, we don't just produce steel, we understand and appreciate beauty. The idea of building a grand concert hall gradually took shape during conversations between Carnegie and conductor Walter Damrosch, who for years had urged New York to build a worthy home for music. And then, at a time when many wealthy individuals chose to build castles, yachts, or monuments bearing their names, Andrew Carnegie made an unusual decision. He would use his own money to build a concert hall for the public, not to glorify himself, but to give America something that ordinary money could not buy: a cultural standard. That decision would lead to the creation of Carnegie Hall. But before music could find a home, a major question remained to be answered: who was capable of creating a space where sound could be perfect? And Carnegie's answer, once again, defied all expectations. When Andrew Carnegie decided to build a concert hall for New York, the next question wasn't money, but who would build it. The elite expected him to choose a renowned architect who could create a monumental structure that would awe at first glance. But Carnegie wasn't looking for awe. He was looking for something far more subtle, a space where sound was treated with utmost respect. And so, he made a choice that surprised many: William Burnett Tuthill. Tuthill was virtually unknown at the time. He had never designed a major building, nor had he made a mark on the New York architectural scene. But he possessed something that Carnegie valued more than fame: an almost absolute obsession with acoustics. Tuthill spent years studying the great concert halls of Europe, not to copy their form, but to understand why they sounded so good. He measured dimensions, noted materials, and observed how sound propagated through space. Tuthill didn't think like a decorative architect. He thought like someone trying to build a colossal musical instrument. Carnegie and Tuthill found common ground in a rare shared experience. Neither believed in meaningless ostentation. Carnegie made it clear from the start that he didn't need a palace. He wanted a place dedicated to music, and if he had to sacrifice appearance for perfect sound, he was willing to do so. For Tuthill, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to test the ideas he had quietly been developing for years. The location of the building only added to the project's controversy. Carnegie chose the corner of 57th Street and 7th Avenue, an area that, even in the late 19th century, was considered far from the center. Critics scoffed. Who would go to a concert in such a remote location? But Carnegie was undeterred. He understood something few at the time saw. The city would develop through infrastructure. The elevated train was expanding, Central Park had drawn the wealthy north, and Midtown was only a matter of time. He wasn't building for the present, but for the New York of the future. When the design began, Tuthill made a fundamental decision. The main auditorium would be a shoebox, a simple rectangular box. No elaborate domes. No fragmented spaces. The acoustically brilliant concert halls in Europe all had this characteristic, and Tuthill believed that the right geometric proportions would accomplish more than any. Decoration. He carefully calculated the length, width, and height of the auditorium so that sound would have enough time to reverberate and dissipate, neither bouncing too quickly nor being swallowed up. Tuthill specifically avoided perfectly parallel walls. He tilted them very slightly, almost imperceptibly to the naked eye, to prevent direct sound reflections that would cause unpleasant echoes. The ceilings were not flat, but gently curved, helping to distribute sound evenly throughout the space. Every surface had a role. No detail was random. Even the size of the stage was designed to accommodate a large orchestra, but not excessively so, to prevent sound energy from being lost. Tuthill invested the most effort into building materials. He didn't choose cheap or easy-to-apply solutions. The walls and ceilings were covered with a special plaster, a mixture of lime, sand, and horsehair, according to a formula that Tuthill believed would create a surface that was both hard and porous at the microscopic level. More importantly, the plaster wasn't applied thickly in one go, but in thin layers, each layer drying before the next. This method was time-consuming and labor-intensive, but it created a surface structure that prevented sound from bouncing back harshly, instead scattering it gently. The auditorium floor is made of wood, leaving a hollow space underneath, like the resonance chamber of a musical instrument. The seats are upholstered in carefully selected fabrics, so that whether people are seated or not, the acoustic properties of the room remain almost unchanged. Every small decision serves a single goal. When the music plays, this space must disappear, leaving only pure sound. Construction costs rose rapidly, and contractors constantly proposed cost-saving options. Each time, Tuthill objected if it jeopardized acoustic quality. Remarkably, Andrew Carnegie always stood by him. Carnegie understood that he wasn't building a structure for profit, but for longevity. This wasn't a project for a decade, but for generations. By 1891, the building was nearly complete. From the outside, it looked elegant but not ostentatious. Inside, everything was ready. But one thing remained uncertain. Would all these calculations actually work? There were no computer simulations, no virtual trials. There was only one way to know the answer: to have the music play before a full orchestra and a packed auditorium. And for that decisive moment, Andrew Carnegie wanted a name big enough to capture the world's attention. He chose Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, the greatest composer living in Europe. It would be the final test for his dream of Carnegie Hall. Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky was not easily persuaded. At 50, he was at the height of his fame in Europe, but he hated long journeys, especially transatlantic ones. Tchaikovsky frequently suffered from anxiety and depression and was very afraid of the unfamiliar. America, in his eyes, was a noisy, rough world, too young to understand the depth of European classical music. But the invitation from Andrew Carnegie was different from any previous one. It was not only a very large fee for the time, but a promise of historical significance. Tchaikovsky would inaugurate America's new concert hall in front of the entire New York elite. After much hesitation, Tchaikovsky agreed. In April 1891, he boarded a ship from France, crossing the Atlantic Ocean in a somber mood. In letters to friends, he admitted to being afraid, tired, and skeptical about the journey. Upon arriving in New York, his initial impression confirmed his fears. The city was too big, too noisy, and the people too hurried. But at the same time, he sensed something else: the genuine eagerness of Americans for serious music. They didn't have the long-standing traditions of Europe, but they yearned for recognition as part of the larger cultural world. Carnegie Hall's opening date was set for May 5, 1891. The program was prepared as a declaration. Tchaikovsky's music would resonate in a completely new setting, affirming America's readiness to enter the arena of artistic powerhouses. The New York Symphony Society and the Oratorio Society of New York joined forces, creating a performance force of nearly 300 people. Tickets sold out quickly, far exceeding all expectations. Those who had previously dismissed 57th Street as too far were now scrambling to be present at this historic night. The final rehearsal took place the afternoon before the grand opening. This was the moment William Tuthill had been waiting for, and also dreading, for years. For the first time, a full orchestra would play in the auditorium he had poured all his faith and intuition into designing. When Tchaikovsky raised his baton and the first notes sounded, Tuthill almost forgot everything around him. He wasn't listening with the ear of an architect, but with the ear of someone who had staked his entire career on this room. The sound spread throughout the auditorium with astonishing naturalness. Even the smallest passages were clear, not swallowed up. The major climaxes rose powerfully, but without being harsh. The instruments blended together while retaining their individuality. There were no unpleasant echoes, no dead spots. Everything worked exactly as, and even beyond, Tuthill had hoped. Legend says that at one moment, Tuthill stopped watching the music and simply listened, realizing that his work truly came to life. That evening, over 2,800 spectators filled every seat. Andrew Carnegie sat in the VIP box with his new wife, Louise Whitfield. The most powerful figures in New York were present. When Tchaikovsky walked onto the stage, the entire audience rose to their feet in a prolonged round of applause before a single note was played. It was not just a welcome for the composer, but a recognition of the moment when America introduced itself to the cultural world. The opening program included important works by Tchaikovsky, including the Solennel March, which he wrote specifically for the occasion. When the music ended, the audience's reaction was almost explosive. The next day, the press unanimously praised not only the music, but also the space that elevated it. Any doubts about the location, the cost, or the choice of architect vanished overnight. Carnegie Hall, in that instant, transcended the status of a newly constructed building. It became a benchmark. Tchaikovsky went on to conduct 4 more concerts during its opening week, all of which were sold out. When he left New York a few weeks later, he left behind not only applause, but a newly born legacy. From the night of May 5, 1891, no one questioned whether Carnegie Hall deserved it. The only question remaining was, how much musical history would pass through this room? And in the decades to come, the answer would far exceed all initial imagination. After its opening night in 1891, Carnegie Hall needed no further publicity. The artists themselves did the work. News of an acoustically unparalleled space spread with astonishing speed through the international music world. Those who had performed in Europe's greatest concert halls began saying the same thing upon arriving in New York. Carnegie Hall was no less, and even surpassed, many legendary venues. What's special about Carnegie Hall is that it doesn't impose itself on the music. It doesn't swallow the sound, nor does it flaunt its presence. It disappears at the right moment, allowing the listener to focus solely on the music. For artists, that feeling is extremely rare. They don't have to strain to push the sound into the auditorium, nor do they have to adjust their playing to counteract the space. Carnegie Hall works with them, like a silent but perfect partner. Just months after its opening, a string of big names emerged. Pianist Ignacy Jan Paderewski made his American debut there and instantly became a star. His concerts lasted late into the night, as audiences constantly demanded encores. Gustav Mahler, when leading the New York Philharmonic in the early 20th century, transformed Carnegie Hall into the place where he inscribed his final interpretations. Those present in the auditorium at the time later recounted that they felt they were witnessing history being written right before their eyes. Carnegie Hall gradually became a benchmark. An artist was considered to have arrived when performing there. A debut at Carnegie Hall could change an entire career. Enrico Caruso, the most famous tenor of his time, chose Carnegie Hall for his New York concerts because he could sing at his best without straining his voice. Sergei Rachmaninoff made his American debut there in 1909 and considered Carnegie Hall his spiritual home for the following decades. For him, it was where his music was best understood. But what truly set Carnegie Hall apart was that it didn't confine itself to a single tradition. Though born from the spirit of European music, it didn't lock itself in an ivory tower of academia. When jazz began to rise as America's new voice, Carnegie Hall didn't turn its back. Benny Goodman's 1938 concert, featuring African-American jazz musicians, marked a turning point. Jazz was for the first time recognized as a serious art form in a space traditionally reserved for symphonies and classical music. That moment held significance far beyond music. It spoke volumes about Carnegie Hall's role in preserving tradition, witnessing the transformation of American culture. From solemn European melodies to vibrant swing rhythms, from opera to blues, the hall treated every sound with the same respect. Therefore, Carnegie Hall didn't become a relic. It became a place where history was continually enriched. Andrew Carnegie died in 1919, but his legacy lived a life of its own. For many years, Carnegie Hall operated as a unique cultural enterprise, not overly commercial, but not entirely dependent on funding either. It thrived on prestige and the genuine needs of both artists and audiences. However, that very model also sowed the seeds for a larger problem to come. As the 20th century approached, New York was changing faster than ever before. The city was rising vertically, and the value of land began to outweigh the value of memory. What had once been considered a cultural center now had to compete directly with the numbers on a spreadsheet. And Carnegie Hall, despite its decades of history and music, still stood on a plot of land in Midtown Manhattan. It is here that a fateful conflict begins to form. On one side, an irreplaceable cultural heritage. On the other, the cold logic of modern real estate. And in that collision, Carnegie Hall is about to face its greatest challenge since the day it was born. By the first half of the 20th century, Carnegie Hall had become a name that transcended architecture and music. It was no longer simply a venue for concerts, but a place where legends were born. For artists, Carnegie Hall was like a landmark. Performing there meant being recognized in history. And it was the continuous accumulation of such moments that made Carnegie Hall's symbolic value immeasurable, beyond monetary measure. The early decades of the 20th century witnessed a constant stream of great names. Vladimir Horowitz made his debut at Carnegie Hall in 1928, when he was very young and virtually unknown in America. In just one evening, everything changed. The audience rose to their feet and applauded in the middle of his concerto, something almost taboo in classical music. The next day, the press hailed him as the new genius of piano. Over the next 60 years, Horowitz returned to Carnegie Hall more than 200 times, considering it the most deeply connected place in his artistic life. Arthur Rubinstein also made Carnegie Hall his annual meeting place. He loved the space so much that he requested to practice on stage without an audience, just to hear how my piano spoke to the room. Marian Anderson, one of the first Black artists to conquer this stage, turned each appearance into a quiet but powerful statement that artistic talent is not limited by race or background. When she performed at Carnegie Hall after her rejection in Washington in 1939, it was not just music, but a moment of social history. Carnegie Hall was not immune to the major changes in popular culture. Jazz, once considered marginal music, entered its arena with increasing confidence. Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, and many other artists brought with them the voice of a different America, youthful, complex, and contradictory. Then came folk, and concerts that transcended classical boundaries. Each time, Carnegie Hall proved that it was not a conservative stronghold, but a space large enough for culture to flourish. That's the paradox. The more spiritually significant Carnegie Hall became, the more economically difficult it became to sustain. Maintaining a large, aging building with stringent acoustic standards was increasingly costly. Meanwhile, revenue from rental performances barely covered operating costs, generating little profit. It wasn't a scalable, replicable, or optimized business in the way the 20th century began to demand. After Andrew Carnegie's death, his family lost interest in maintaining such a cultural and business model. In 1925, Carnegie Hall was sold to Robert E. Simon Sr., a real estate developer who loved music and appreciated the building's value. Under Simon's ownership, Carnegie Hall continued to operate almost unchanged. But when he died in 1935, the burden fell on his son, Robert E. Simon Jr., in a rapidly accelerating New York. By the 1950s, Midtown Manhattan had become the world's financial center. Office towers sprang up, and land values soared. The plot where Carnegie Hall stood, viewed from a market perspective, was no longer a place for music, but a wasted opportunity. A new tower could generate far more profit than even sold out. Concerts. Robert E. Simon Jr. understood the cultural value of Carnegie Hall, but he also understood a harsh reality. He lacked the financial means to continue maintaining the building in the long term. Outdated systems needed replacing, walls and ceilings needed repairing, and the stage needed reinforcement. Without substantial funding, Carnegie Hall gradually became a burden. And then, in the mid-1950s, an inevitable decision was made. Carnegie Hall was put up for sale. When the news broke, the music world was shocked. Many still believe that no one would dare demolish Carnegie Hall. But the market doesn't operate on belief. A real estate developer quickly appeared, with plans to demolish the entire structure to build a modern one. Legally, everything was legitimate. Carnegie Hall wasn't protected by any heritage laws. It was just an old building on private land. At this point, one thing became clear: all the history, all the music, all the memories accumulated over more than half a century had no legal value to defend themselves. And it was at this fragile point that the story of Carnegie Hall entered its most dramatic phase, the moment when a great cultural landmark faced the risk of disappearing forever, simply because it wasn't generating profits quickly enough. By the late 1950s, the fate of Carnegie Hall no longer rested in the hands of artists or audiences, but was firmly rooted in the cold logic of modern urban real estate. New York was then caught up in a development philosophy called urban renewal. In this philosophy, old buildings, no matter how beautiful or significant, were seen as obstacles to progress. The city had to be taller, newer, and more profitable. And anything that didn't fit into that cycle could be sacrificed. Carnegie Hall possessed all the elements that made it the ideal victim. It was old. It occupied an extremely valuable piece of land in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. It served a type of art that many in political circles viewed as elite. And most importantly, it didn't generate a return commensurate with the value of the land beneath. While an office tower can bring in millions of dollars annually, Carnegie Hall barely covered its operating and maintenance costs. In that context, the decision to demolish Carnegie Hall was not seen as vandalism by many administrators, but rather as a logical step. The clearest representative of this thinking was Robert Moses, the most powerful figure in New York City planning for decades, even though he was never elected. Moses believed that the city must be constantly reinvented with new, larger, and more efficient buildings. For him, emotion and nostalgia were luxuries. If a building no longer suited current needs, it should be replaced, regardless of its glorious past. In that view, Carnegie Hall wasn't the soul of music, but merely an aging structure occupying a strategic location. And because it was private property, the law wasn't on the side of its lovers. There were no conservation laws, no monument designation, no legal barriers preventing a legitimate owner from selling the building to a real estate developer. The sale was signed. Demolition plans were drawn up. Drawings of a replacement tower began to appear. The most frightening thing is not hostility, but indifference. No one hates Carnegie Hall. People simply see it as something to be traded away. And it is this indifference that poses the greatest threat to cultural heritage. Because when every decision is reduced to economic efficiency, memory, identity, and history lose their voice. News of Carnegie Hall's impending demolition spread, sending shockwaves through the music world. But initially, the reaction was disjointed. Many believed that someone will surely save it. Perhaps the city would intervene. Perhaps an art-loving billionaire would appear. Perhaps everything would work itself out at the last minute. The danger lay in that very belief, the belief that important things would naturally be protected. The reality is quite the opposite. Without public pressure, without alternative plans, without concrete action, Carnegie Hall will disappear as scheduled. Concerts will continue as usual, but below the stage, the clock is ticking. Every performance now could be one of the last, unbeknownst to the audience. And it was in that seemingly desperate moment that a truth gradually became clear. Without human action, history would be erased in a very legal way, not by explosives or violence, but by signatures, seals, and numbers on contracts. Carnegie Hall was in danger of becoming a prime example of how a civilization could deliberately erase what constitutes its own value. That's when Isaac Stern realized that simply loving Carnegie Hall wasn't enough. To save it, he had to turn that love into a real battle, not just on stage, but in public opinion, in politics, and in the law. And from that moment, the struggle to save Carnegie Hall officially entered its most intense phase. Isaac Stern understood something that many others hadn't yet realized. Carnegie Hall couldn't be saved by regret, but only by organized action. He also understood that time was not on his side. Once the legal wheels started rolling, all lamentations would be meaningless. So Stern decided to do something no other artist in New York had ever done on this scale before. He became the leader of a heritage preservation movement. Stern began with those who knew Carnegie Hall best, the artists. He called every conductor, every soloist, every music instructor who had ever performed on that stage. Leonard Bernstein, Vladimir Horowitz, members of the New York Philharmonic, the Juilliard leadership, they all received the same message. If they remained silent, Carnegie Hall would disappear, and they would never have a chance to return. Stern didn't appeal with vague nostalgia. He stated directly, this was a fight for survival. But Stern also understood that the artist's voice, however prestigious, was not enough. He needed the public. He needed to turn what seemed like a luxury issue into a story for the entire city. Stern appeared on radio, television, and in newspapers, repeating a simple, yet incisive argument. Carnegie Hall was not just a building, it was a musical instrument. And like a Stradivarius, it could not be replaced by a modern replica, no matter how expensive. Stern's way of speaking was quite different from the dry, preservation speeches of the past. He didn't talk about architectural style or the year it was built. He talked about the feeling a musician gets when they draw their violin and know for sure that the sound will reach the listener's heart. He talked about performances that change people's lives. He talked about how demolishing Carnegie Hall would be like destroying a part of New York's shared memory. And most importantly, he made those who had never set foot in Carnegie Hall feel a sense of loss if it disappeared. The movement began to spread. Fundraising concerts were organized. Petitions gathered thousands of signatures. The press began to ask the city government difficult questions. Why would New York, the city that claims to be the cultural capital of America, allow its greatest concert hall to be destroyed? But Stern didn't stop at creating public pressure. He knew that public opinion, without a concrete solution, would soon cool down. Stern's strategic move lay in a bold idea. New York City had to buy Carnegie Hall. Not some random benefactor, not a private corporation, but the city government. Carnegie Hall had to become public property, permanently protected from the short-sighted logic of the market. But this idea immediately met with fierce opposition. Many politicians argued that using taxpayer money to buy a concert hall was unacceptable, especially when the city was already short of funds for schools, housing, and social welfare. Opponents also put forward a seemingly logical argument. New York was already building Lincoln Center, a modern cultural complex with a new concert hall. Why save an old, expensive structure when a newer, more modern one was nearing completion? Stern answered without hesitation. No one knew what the new concert hall would be like until it was tested. Gambling Carnegie Hall, a space already proven perfect, on an unproven promise, he argued, was irresponsible towards history. The debate quickly transcended the realm of music. It became a question of the role of government in protecting heritage, of whether a city should be defined by what it builds or what it chooses to preserve. Isaac Stern, from being an artist, transformed himself into a spokesperson for a larger point. There are values whose fate the market has no right to decide. As the city council and state legislature hearings began, Stern appeared not as a plea, but as a witness to history. He knew this was a pivotal moment. Failure would mean Carnegie Hall would be demolished not because it was hated, but because no one was resolute enough to defend it. And it was here that the fate of America's greatest concert hall began to be weighed on the political and legal scales. The hearings on the fate of Carnegie Hall quickly became one of the most heated debates in New York's political and cultural life at the time. For the first time, a concert hall was no longer discussed as an architectural structure, but as a question of urban identity. Isaac Stern entered the chamber not as a performing artist, but as a representative of the city's collective memory. He understood that speaking only emotionally would lead to defeat. Therefore, Stern prepared meticulously. each argument aimed at transforming his love for Carnegie Hall into a viable solution. At the hearings, Stern and his supporters didn't say that Carnegie Hall was beautiful or lovely. They said it was irreplaceable. Acoustical experts were invited to testify, explaining that even with advances in modern science, it's impossible to guarantee the reconstruction of an acoustically equivalent space. Music administrators pointed out that Carnegie Hall was not just a performance venue, but a benchmark for training, for comparison, and for evaluating artistic quality. Losing Carnegie Hall would mean losing a globally recognized standard. The opponents were not at all weak. They asked a very direct question. Why should taxpayers in the Bronx or Brooklyn have to pay to save a concert hall they might never have set foot in their lifetime? They argued that the government shouldn't use public funds to preserve spaces that serve a small group. And above all, they emphasized that the city needed the money for far more pressing needs. It was at this point that Stern changed tactics. He didn't argue who Carnegie Hall served, but rather who it belonged to. He argued that Carnegie Hall was a shared cultural asset, like a public library or a park, even if not everyone used it regularly. Its value lay in its very existence, in the fact that it represented the city's ability to create and preserve beauty. If the city only invested in things that yielded immediate benefits, then the government had abandoned its role as guardian of the future. A crucial turning point occurred when Stern proposed a specific management model. The city would own it, but an independent nonprofit organization would operate it. This allayed concerns that politics would interfere with the arts program. Carnegie Hall would not become a tool for propaganda or be forced to cater to short-term tastes for profit. It would be legally protected, but still run by people who understood and respected music. Alongside the hearings, Stern skillfully lobbied behind the scenes. He secured the support of Mayor Robert Wagner, who was facing political pressure and understood that saving Carnegie Hall would send a strong message about New York's cultural role. More importantly, Stern received positive signals from New York State Governor Nelson Rockefeller, a man with a family background deeply rooted in the arts. This support was not only symbolic, but also paved the way for a state-level financial solution. The debate dragged on for months, while the demolition clock ticked silently. Finally, in the spring of 1960, a bill allowing New York City to acquire Carnegie Hall was introduced before the state legislature. It was a decisive moment. If the bill failed, all previous efforts would be in vain. But this time, the weight of public opinion, the support of experts, and political vision all converged at the right time. The bill was passed. New York State approved the necessary funds for the city to purchase Carnegie Hall for $5 million. The day Governor Rockefeller signed the document, the building's fate changed forever. The deal with the real estate developer was canceled. Demolition plans were shelved. The demolition ball was, quite literally, stopped by a hair's breadth. Carnegie Hall was saved not by miracle, but by a rare coincidence. The right solution at the right time, by people persistent enough to pursue it to the end. But this victory was only the first step. For saving a building from demolition is one thing, but keeping it alive, functioning, and worthy of its heritage is an entirely different challenge. A challenge that will begin as soon as the initial sigh of relief subsides. Saving Carnegie Hall from demolition was a historic victory, but as soon as the initial joy subsided, an unavoidable truth emerged. Keeping Carnegie Hall alive was harder than saving it. 70 years of continuous performances had left its mark everywhere in the building. Cracked walls, peeling ceilings, sagging stage floors in many places, outdated heating and ventilation systems, and old electrical wiring that no longer met safety standards. Carnegie Hall was saved from the demolition ball, but it was aging rapidly. Isaac Stern, now not only the savior but also the first president of Carnegie Hall Corporation, understood that without immediate action, the building could die a less dramatic but equally tragic death. The problem was, Carnegie Hall couldn't be repaired like any other building. This wasn't a place to be upgraded arbitrarily. Every wall, every layer of plaster, every floorboard was directly related to its most valuable asset, acoustics. One of the new management's first decisions was to invite leading acoustics experts to scientifically study Carnegie Hall. They measured reverberation time, analyzed sound reflections, and mapped the acoustics in each area of the auditorium. The results were both encouraging and humble. The experts could accurately describe what Carnegie Hall sounded like, but they couldn't fully explain why it was so perfect. The 19th century plaster formula, the method of applying thin layers by hand, the microscopic irregularities on the surface, all contributed to the sound, but no single factor alone could explain everything. This made the restoration work an extremely delicate problem. Replacing the materials with modern ones for convenience could permanently alter the sound. Making the surface prettier or flatter could worsen the acoustics. Engineers and craftsmen were forced to relearn nearly extinct techniques, applying lime plaster in the old way, accepting visual imperfections to preserve auditory perfection. Carnegie Hall, during its restoration, was treated like an antique instrument, where every intervention had to be as careful as changing the strings of a Stradivarius. The work was slow and costly. There was no other way. The most important items were prioritized: structural reinforcement, repairs to the deteriorating ceilings and walls, and fixing damage that could directly affect acoustics. Aesthetic elements had to wait. Throughout this process, Carnegie Hall remained open for performances. Concerts took place alongside the sounds of hammers and drills echoing in other areas. Audiences occasionally heard construction noises interspersed with very faint pianissimo passages, but for the most part, they accepted it. They understood that this was the price to pay to keep the place alive. Alongside the restoration came the financial challenge. Carnegie Hall, now a public asset, could not continue to live in a state of budget crisis. Isaac Stern once again became a campaigner, this time not to save it from demolition, but to build a sustainable financial foundation. He appealed for contributions from cultural foundations, businesses, and art-loving individuals. He convinced them that contributing to Carnegie Hall was not spending on the past, but investing in the city's cultural future. During that process, one thing became increasingly clear. Carnegie Hall needed not only preservation, but also ongoing care. Heritage is not something that can be saved once and for all. It requires patience, knowledge, and long-term commitment. And it was during this period that Carnegie Hall began to transform from a building on the verge of demolition into a living symbol of how society can treat its heritage, not as a burden, but as an accepted and cherished responsibility. But the impact of the rescue of Carnegie Hall didn't stop at the building itself. What happened made many, both inside and outside the government, realize a terrifying truth. Without Isaac Stern, without a sufficiently strong movement, Carnegie Hall would have disappeared completely legally. And if that could happen to Carnegie Hall, then no historical building is truly safe. That realization would soon lead to a much larger consequence. Not just for New York, but for the entire way America views and protects its cultural heritage. The realization that Carnegie Hall nearly disappeared due to a lack of legal safeguards sparked a new wave of thinking among American urban planners and cultural figures. If such an iconic building could be legally demolished, then hundreds, even thousands, of other historical structures faced similar risks. 3 years after Carnegie Hall was saved, New York witnessed another shock. Pennsylvania Station, a masterpiece of Beaux-Arts architecture, was demolished to make way for Madison Square Garden. This time, there was no second Isaac Stern to appear, and the image of the magnificent station being torn down made the public realize they could no longer remain silent. It was from this series of events that the heritage preservation movement in New York, and later throughout the United States, began to take shape seriously. In 1965, the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission was established, for the first time granting the city the legal authority to protect buildings of historical and cultural value. Carnegie Hall, once a building nearly demolished for being unprofitable, became living proof of why preservation laws must exist. The fight initiated by Isaac Stern went beyond the scope of a concert hall. It changed how an entire society viewed the relationship between development and memory. Over the following decades, Carnegie Hall continued to be restored and upgraded with the same overarching principle. Modernization where necessary, but never at the expense of its acoustic soul. A major restoration project in the 1980s restored the main auditorium to its original cream gold hue. In 2003, the neglected underground space was rediscovered to become Zankel Hall. expanding its capacity for contemporary and experimental music. That year, the main auditorium was also named the Stern Auditorium, a testament to the fact that without Isaac Stern, the room would not have existed to bear that name. Carnegie Hall entered the 21st century in a rare position, both a meticulously protected heritage site and a vibrant, dynamic performance space unfrozen by the past. Each year, hundreds of concerts take place, ranging from classical symphonies, jazz, and world music to educational projects that bring children and communities previously unfamiliar with classical music into the auditorium. Carnegie Hall doesn't define itself as a museum. It defines itself as a place where music continues to happen. Oddly enough, despite the ever-advancing science of acoustics and the constant emergence of new concert halls with budgets of hundreds of millions of dollars around the world, Carnegie Hall has maintained its special status. Many modern venues require repeated renovations because the acoustics don't meet expectations. Meanwhile, the room, built in 1891 with lime, mortar, wood, and human intuition, still functions almost perfectly. For artists, this reinforces an almost mystical belief. There are achievements that cannot be replicated by technology and money alone. Today, standing before Carnegie Hall at the corner of 57th Street and 7th Avenue, one sees a building that appears unassuming amidst towering glass structures. But it is precisely this humility that is its strength. It exists not to flaunt power, but to serve music. Inside, the stage where Tchaikovsky once stood, where Horowitz once played, where thousands of artists have left their mark on life, remains almost intact. The sound still resonates as it did more than a century ago, without amplification, without alteration of its essence. The story of Carnegie Hall, viewed from afar, is more than just the story of a concert hall. It's a story of human choice. A choice between demolition and preservation, between short-term profit and long-term value, between a city that only knows how to build and a city mature enough to say, there are things, even if unprofitable, that are worth keeping. Carnegie Hall stands there today because, at one time, people decided that music, memory, and identity mattered more than the numbers on a spreadsheet. And as long as such decisions are made, spaces imbued with the soul of human culture will have a chance to live on. The music still plays, the room still listens, and the acoustic secrets left behind by William Tuthill, along with the cultural ideals of Andrew Carnegie and the unwavering resolve of Isaac Stern, continue to blend together, reminding us that some things, once lost, can never be recovered.